What if you're pronounced dead and you're not really dead? It happened in Lincoln, Nebraska not too long ago.
The 74-year-old woman who was initially pronounced dead but later found to be breathing.
If you're familiar with this, if you're not, hold tight. I'm Nathan, musician, mortician. Spent 13 years in the funeral profession. Be sure to subscribe, click the bell to be notified when I release content just like this. My music is inspired by my works. You'd be like, why do people get inspired by funerals? Well, I think it's where you meet people where they truly are during the most delicate of times. And what worse way to meet someone than like this sweet little 74-year-old Constance Glantz, Lincoln, Nebraska. This is a few weeks ago. She dies. She's under hospice care and then is received by a funeral home in Lincoln, Nebraska. She's taken from the cot, the transport cot that went to the place of death, back to the funeral home, and then is transferred over to a table that will be used for the embalming process. The embalmer, this is a few hours later, mind you, the embalmer is beginning to gather, and I can just imagine there's all these embalming chemicals and the instruments. There's this meticulous way that every embalmer works. You know, there's more than one way to skin a cat. I probably shouldn't use that analogy here, but my point is they have their instruments a certain place. They have the way in which they mix the embalming chemicals. Basically, embalming, 30,000-foot view, is delaying the natural process of decomposition. It's prolonging it, if you will, so that a family can have a positive, as comfortable as possible viewing experience. And then, at one point, the embalmer, funeral home staff is what is quoted, looks over and Mrs. Glantz is breathing. Picture this. Your job is, as an embalmer, you sit in a room, in an area, and your job is to reverently care for the deceased. Could you imagine the big mind F right there? You're just blown. Your mind's blown. So it is said that they begin CPR. Now, that's the part that I do have questions about if they were breathing. But they do call emergency services. They call 911 in the United States of America. They come to the funeral home. Ambulance comes and takes the once deceased person that was then transported in a vehicle that is designated for transferring of deceased persons to a funeral home, placed on an embalming table for deceased persons. They were preparing to embalm Mrs. Glantz. To then look over, they're breathing, and then the ambulance now, there's a live Mrs. Glantz that was once dead, that was once transferred. She's taken to the hospital only to die again 2 hours later. I have so many questions. Like, did they go back to that hospital? Mrs. Glantz's memory be eternal. Could you imagine the grief that this family is experiencing? Not only did their loved one die once, they died twice. Not only did they die twice, the trauma surrounding it. Let's talk about the funeral home and staff. They go about doing their job and doing their job well. This staff member who went into work ready to care for, serve, tend to the deceased. What a humbling act to care for, bathe. There's a lot more steps, but I just want to point that out. So there's this holiness to this job. There's a shell of someone who once was fully alive. Now they're deceased. And when they turn, however, and I could just envision this, the breathing, the trauma, what do I do? I don't want to say feel sorry for. I don't know what the right words are, but I hope that the funeral home employee, the staff even of the home, are comforted. And I also hope that Miss Constance experienced peace and comfort throughout. I couldn't imagine. There were other stories, quote unquote, documented where I think it was Philadelphia a few years back. This happened to a man, a 71-year-old, if I'm not mistaken, pronounced dead at the hospital, placed in a body bag, taken from the hospital to the funeral home, placed on the table, and then woke back up. And I've been hesitant to share that one because there wasn't as much media surrounding it. And I also think that was also before COVID, if I'm not mistaken, which COVID permitted all of us to talk about what we didn't want to talk about. And it was grief and sadness and heaviness and death. Because for the United States of America specifically, I feel like we think it's this voluntary thing. Oh, well, we pay to stay young. We pay to look young. We pay to be young. We lie about our age because we don't want to embrace getting older. And I'm not a psychologist or therapist, but I see that. And we've over time just given, as I've alluded to in the beginning of this video, and if you're still with me, I'm grateful. Let me know in the comments below if you're familiar with this Lincoln, Nebraska story. And also be sure to subscribe and click the bell to be notified when I release content such as this, I think we gave away the process of celebration, of memorializing loved ones. I think we've also devalued ourselves for so long. No one wants to come to our visitation. We don't matter. We don't matter. We don't matter. And it's the lies we tell ourselves. I think the pandemic slowly is allowing you all to speak about it. Grief, sadness, the things that maybe make you uncomfortable, but it creates this sense of community and realization that we're in this together and we're all experiencing this muck together. And you all are taking back the process of celebration and creating that. And I know I'm getting in the weeds a little bit there, but I want to make that clear that may be why that this became a story. And also, I know that our bodies are machines and slowly they will shut down during this dying process. And I know that there's this delay in breathing and I'm not sure what happened in this instance because I'm not a doctor, but in the 1800s, for instance, they would put mirrors under the nose and if it fogged up, well, they're still breathing. They would put bells at the top of the graves and they would ring the bell if they came back to life. Now, there's not any documented cases and stories where the bell rang that I found. I'm sure it happened because I don't know what my point is. It's just it's up. Let me know in the comments below. Have you had an experience like this? I mean, maybe not. I mean, this is like 1 in a quadrillion. And are you familiar with this story? Are you familiar with this funeral home? I have so many questions, just so many questions. And everyone who is involved in this, the family of Mrs. Constance and the funeral home and the medical staff, and there's probably a lawsuit or two somewhere in there, but I won't speak to that. I just wanted to make you aware that when you're pronounced dead, you might not be. Oh, Lord. I'd quit. I would quit. Be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you at the next video.